Hello, good evening, and welcome to Studio G for this very special virtual pre-concert presentation. I'm sorry that I can't be there live and in person, but even so, it's an honor for me to get to share a little with you in preparation for this evening's concert. Thank you so much for being here. For folks who don't know me, my name is Garrett McQueen. I work in the field of Western classical music in many capacities. I'm a bassoonist, first and foremost. I work as a digital and broadcast media producer. I work as an advocate, activist, and arts administrator, but most importantly, at least as far as this presentation is concerned, I work as an artistic advisor for the Lakes Area Music Festival. I want to send a special shout out to Scott and Taylor for their leadership team and for inviting me to offer a few words this evening, and to all of the stagehands, managers, musicians, and volunteers who have made this evening possible. Thank you. But most importantly, thanks again to you for your continued support of not only the Lakes Area Music Festival, but for all of the live art that you help make possible in your communities. All Lakes Area Music Festival activities, including this one, are made possible by the voters of Minnesota through grants from the Five Wings Arts Council and Minnesota State Arts Board through a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So, as I hope you've noticed this summer, the overall theme for this Lakes Area Music Festival season is Worlds Connect. That concept and general theme of Worlds Connect is actually a really great starting point for me to offer some context for tonight's show. The music of Franz Joseph Haydn, Dmitri Shostakovich, and Isaac Santos may not seem to be so connected on a surface level, but my goal this evening is to help you see some of the interconnectedness that I see in this program. We have a new work by a living composer, Isaac Santos, which connects to the idea of the creation of new work and new ideas as realized by Dmitri Shostakovich in his day. And then going even further back into history, we have the 18th century's Franz Joseph Haydn, whose chamber and symphonic works inspired the structure that not only Shostakovich worked within to a degree, but many other composers as well. So just a sample there of what you'll be diving into this evening. Beginning with Haydn, he was born in Austria back in 1732, and he grew up to become known in his time and throughout history as the father of the string quartet. You'll also sometimes see him referred to as the father of the symphony because, well, he wrote a lot of them. It's his final symphony that's on the program tonight, his 1795 Symphony number 104. It's interesting that this work and this composer fall under the season theme of Worlds Connect because as connected to the Western classical genre as Haydn is, much of his output was actually born on the opposite end of that spectrum, very unconnected to the rest of the world. You have to understand that Haydn, like many composers of his day, worked as a court musician for much of his life. This isolated him from the other musical happenings of the world because, well, he was busy tending to the Esterházy family. They paid him to live and thrive as a composer, so maybe you can understand why it was hard for Haydn to keep his ear to the ground, so to speak, when his entire life and musical output centered around a single family. This is something that he recognized himself even. You can find a quote out there where Haydn basically says that relative isolation forced him to be original. He didn't have other people to copy from or anything, and maybe that can be considered one of the primary reasons why we still talk about him today, the connectedness that his unconnectedness inspired over history. One of the really unique things about Haydn is that he was working for the Esterházy family not only as someone who had to write music that they liked, but someone who had to write music that the family could play. Around 1765, Prince Nicholas of the family was learning to play an instrument called the baryton. I don't even think I've ever seen one in real life, and maybe Haydn hadn't either, but he had to write for it. So thanks to this unique job of his, there are over 200 pieces of music that utilize the baryton. Haydn's ability to write lots of works in a single category didn't stop there, of course. As I mentioned, he wrote a whopping 104 symphonies, and what's unique about them in the Western classical catalog, especially for that time, is that many of them were given nicknames based on some of the aspects of the pieces. For example, his 103rd symphony is known as the Drum Roll Symphony, so I guess you can imagine what instrument gets a prominent role there, right? He also has his Miracle Symphony, the Clock Symphony, and even ones named after animals. His 82nd symphony is called the Bear, and the one that followed, his 83rd symphony, was nicknamed the Hen. Well, the piece you'll hear tonight also has a nickname. It's known as the London Symphony. It's important to note and understand that Haydn didn't spend his entire life serving the Esterhazy family. He did indeed find his own way eventually, and that took him over to London once upon a time. That's actually where he wrote his final 12 symphonies. Technically, they're all known as the London Symphonies, but it's the final one that most folks think of when you say Haydn's London Symphony, his symphony number 104. He made today's equivalent of about $2,300 for his 104th symphony. Not a bad commission fee, if you ask me, and as is the case with many composers' final symphonies, there's a lot of culmination in the work. You'll hear some of the humor that's in his previously composed Surprise Symphony. You have the very traditional Western classical aesthetic to the front in this piece, as heard in most of his music, but you also have lots of energy in his symphony number 104. Haydn really passed the torch by making sure the finale of his final symphony sounded like that. It sounded like a finale, so you'll be sure to know when the piece is done, even if you aren't that familiar with it. So there's a lot that I could say about Haydn's continued impact on the world of music, how he helped codify things like the symphonic form and the construction of the string quartet, more things than you're probably interested in this evening, but it's important to understand to a degree because as far as Western classical music is concerned, Haydn really did put a lot in place. If Haydn is one of the first great symphonists or writer of symphonies, I think it's safe to consider the next composer I'll tell you about one of the last great symphonists. Maybe not the last, but certainly a composer who took all of those fancy words and structures and brought them into the 20th century and created more thematic and programmatic connections with that form so that audiences could understand. I'm talking, of course, about Dmitri Shostakovich. Something that you may not know about him. About 80 years ago, Shostakovich made the cover of Time magazine. This was due in part to his unique relationship with politics in those days. These days, people tend to try and separate the political from the musical, but Shostakovich really leaned into that connectedness. By making the cover of Time magazine, Shostakovich became a sort of symbol for the Soviet struggle against outsiders. If you know much about Shostakovich, you might also know that he wasn't always celebrated at home. His music was deemed by Joseph Stalin as formalist or not for the people, and after a really scathing review of one of his works in the Russian newspapers, he found himself watching his back at all times. Toward the end of his life, he actually stopped opposing the Soviet regime and joined forces with them. Some say that he couldn't beat them, so he joined them. Others say other things, but it's important just to understand that his life and his music always had a sort of a political slant. What I'd say is his most famous work, at least when it comes to his symphonies, is his Fifth Symphony. He used the same basic symphonic structure as Haydn did hundreds of years later, but used a more modern orchestra with more instruments to tell a more modern story. The opening of that Fifth Symphony is really dark and almost grimacing. It reminds me of an occupied city where people are afraid to say or do what they really want. And I think that idea comes through in the work really clearly. But what do you think happened when folks were outside of the eyesight of Big Brother? I imagine even in Soviet Russia that there was a lot of joking and sarcasm against the regime behind closed doors, and Shostakovich made that clear in his music as well. All of these musical and emotional aesthetics and ideas can be found not only in his symphonies, but also in the work of his you'll hear this evening, his first piano concerto. He finished it back in 1933, so it's not even 100 years old yet. And he wrote it as a sort of example of what he called neo-Baroque music, or music that's inspired by what folks just before Haydn's time were writing. It's also a really fascinating work because it's actually a double concerto of sorts. The piano takes the lead alongside a solo trumpet that helps add to the push and pull of his emotional and musical dissonances. You'll understand what I mean when you hear it here later on this evening. Now, Shostakovich did end up writing another piano concerto, which is just as popular, I'd say, but it's his first piano concerto that really showcases the way he connected to his world and his day, and how we can have a glimpse into what that world looked like. And that, of course, takes me to the final composer, who I'll tell you a little about. The first composer who will be featured on tonight's concert. He's a very much living composer and a very much young composer named Isaac Santos. Isaac is based in Ohio, where he's studying at the Oberlin Conservatory, and he really represents what's at the traditional core of Western classical music, despite what his music actually sounds like. You see, these days we tend to focus on what's really old, sometimes what's really, really old, myself included. But Shostakovich and even Haydn operated very much within the confines of their time. Well, Isaac is doing the same thing, just in this 21st century when we're alive. His music will start tonight's program. As I mentioned, it's a brand new work called Moon Seen Through Leaves. I already spoke to nicknames as they relate to Haydn's music, things like his drum roll and his hen. Well, try and imagine what you might be able to expect with a piece titled that way, Moon Seen Through Leaves. It should have been an incredible work that I'm sure you will enjoy. Congrats to Isaac for his success as an emerging composer so far, and best of luck for much more success in the future. So that's just a little about tonight's program. Moon Seen Through Leaves by Isaac Santos, the Piano Concerto No. 1, a work for orchestra, solo piano, and solo trumpet by Dmitri Shostakovich, and the 104th and final symphony of Franz Joseph Haydn, also known as the London Symphony. Thanks again to everyone who's made tonight's concert possible, all of the Lakes Area Music Festival leadership and staff, and thanks to you for attending tonight's show. Can't wait to be back with you live and in person once and again in beautiful Brainerd, but until then, happy listening. See you next time.